If your father came home from the Pacific, there is a good chance there is a Japanese sword somewhere in your family right now. You may have seen it once, when you were 9, maybe 10 years old. He took it down from a shelf on a Saturday afternoon and let you hold it for exactly 30 seconds. And then he put it back and did not speak of it again for the rest. Maybe you found it after his funeral, wrapped in a shirt at the bottom of a footlocker, behind the flag they gave your mother at the graveside. You never asked him where it came from, and now you cannot. This is the story of that sword, and of the young American Marines who were told, in the smoke and the noise of the worst days of their lives, never to reach for one. Some of them listened, some of them did not, and the ones who did not are the reason a 19-year-old boy from Ohio or Iowa or Georgia never came home to the mother who waited on the porch every afternoon for the mailman. Because on a Pacific island in the summer of 1944, boys like that saw swords lying in the dirt beside dead Japanese officers. What nobody had told them, what nobody standing there could even see, was that the dead man was rarely the trap. The ground around the sword was. Picture the scene. There is a clearing. There is heat. There is the wet, green smell of a jungle that has been burning for 3 days and cannot decide whether to stop. And there is a young American Marine, 20 years old, maybe 21, crouched behind the twisted root of a banyan tree with his rifle balanced against his thigh and his heart hammering so hard he can feel it in his teeth. 10 yards ahead of him, face down in the churned red dirt, lies a Japanese officer. The officer is dead. That much is certain. His uniform is dark with something that used to be inside him. His right arm is folded beneath his chest. His left arm is thrown out, fingers curled, palm up, as if he had reached for something in his final second and never quite. And beside that outstretched hand, resting in the dirt like a gift left by the war itself, is a sword. The scabbard is black. The hilt is bound in silk cord the color of dried blood. The guard catches a single blade of sunlight and throws it back into the young Marine's eyes like a signal flare. He stares at it. He knows he shouldn't move. He knows the sergeant is somewhere behind him in the tree line, watching, waiting to see if anyone in the squad has learned anything at all. But the sword is right there, and in the next few seconds, if he takes 3 more steps forward, he may never go home again. Not because of a bullet, not because of the officer, not because of any hand he can see, because he wanted a souvenir. Scenes like the one you are picturing right now played out on island after island in the Pacific between 1942 and 19... not always ending in death, but often enough that the American War Department eventually put warnings about them in official intelligence bulletins. And senior officers began asking their men, in the tired language of exhausted commanders, to please just leave the trophies where they... This is the story of how the most beautiful souvenir of the Pacific War became one of its quietest killers. It is the story of a promise wrapped in silk and steel, and the men who reached for it, and the men who didn't come back. It is the story of an order that spread through American Marine divisions in the theater, whispered from sergeant to private, printed in intelligence bulletins, and repeated by any officer who wanted his boys to see home again. Do not pick up the sword. Do not touch the flag. Do not walk toward the body. Walk past it. Leave it lying in the dirt. If you were born in the 1940s or 1950s, you grew up in a house where the war was still in the walls. Your father did not talk about it. Your mother did not ask. And on Sunday afternoons, the radio played Glenn Miller, and everyone pretended it was over. But it was not over. Not in the men who came home. Not in the drawers where the things they brought back with them sat gathering dust. And not in the story that is about to unfold on the screen in front of you. To understand why that order existed, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a jungle in the South Pacific in the summer of 1942, where American Marines were about to fight the first ground battle of their war, and where the trouble was already starting before a single trap had been laid. The name of that jungle was Guadalcanal. On the 7th of August, 1942, the 1st Marine Division came ashore in landing craft that stank of diesel and vomit and salt. They were young. Most of them had never seen a dead man. Some of them had never seen the ocean. They waded through waist-deep surf onto black volcanic sand. And they looked up at a wall of jungle that looked less like a place and more like a mouth. And then they walked into it. Among them was a private named Robert Leckie. He was 22 years old. He had grown up in New Jersey, the son of Irish immigrants, and before the war he had been a newspaperman, a sports writer, a kid with a typewriter and a head full of words he didn't yet know what to do with. He had enlisted in January of 1942. He had trained at Paris Island. He had shipped out for the Pacific with a machine gun assigned to him and a notebook hidden in his pack. Leckie was a machine gunner in H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. He carried a Browning water-cooled .30 caliber gun, the M1917, that weighed more than he wanted to think. He was skeptical, sharp-tongued, and quietly terrified, which is to say he was exactly the kind of young man the Marine Corps was built to grind into a soldier. And within his first weeks on Guadalcanal, he began to notice something strange about the men around him. They wanted things, not food, not water, not letters from home, although those they wanted too. They wanted things that had belonged to the enemy, a helmet with a bullet hole through it, a canteen with Japanese characters stamped on the side, pistol, a rifle, a flag folded small and stained with sweat and blood, and, above all else, if you were lucky enough, if the gods of the jungle favored you that day, a sword. There was a joke that went around the theater that year. Someone claimed to have gotten it from a captured Japanese pilot in the middle of October, sitting across from an American flyer in a wooden chair with a cigarette between his fingers. The pilot supposedly said this: "The Germans fight for Hitler, the Japanese fight for the Emperor, and the American Marines seem to be fighting for souvenirs." The Marine veteran and author William Manchester later remembered the same joke told cleaner: "The Japanese for the Emperor, the British for glory, the Americans for souvenirs." It was funny. It was also true. And it was already in the summer of 1942 quietly beginning to kill American Marines. On the night of the 21st of August, 1942, a Japanese colonel named Kiyonao Ichiki led roughly 900 men in a full frontal charge against the American Marine lines dug in along a stretch of water on the eastern side of the Lunga perimeter. The Americans called that water the Tanaru River. They had misnamed it. It was actually the Ilu. The name stuck anyway, the way wrong names stick in wars, because the men who fought there were too tired to correct anyone. Ichiki was 49 years old. He had been an infantry officer for most of his adult life. He had come to Guadalcanal believing what his superiors had told him, which was that the American Marines on the island were disorganized, poorly supplied, and would break at the first serious push. He had brought with him the first echelon of the 28th Infantry Regiment, veterans of China, hard men who believed in the Emperor and in the sword and in dying well. He gave the order to charge across a sandbar at the mouth of the river. The American Marines were waiting. They had machine guns dug in on the far bank. They had artillery zeroed in on the crossing. They had a full night of preparation, and they had learned something in their first 2 weeks in the jungle that Ichiki had refused to believe. The Marines would not break. By the time the sun came up on the 22nd of August, Ichiki's detachment had been all but destroyed as a fighting force. Roughly 800 of his 900 men lay dead in the sand and the shallow water. Their bodies were tangled in the wire. They floated in the river mouth. They lay in heaps at the base of the American guns. Ichiki himself was dead. Some accounts say he was killed in the fight. Others say he burned his regimental colors and shot himself when he realized the attack had failed. And the culture he had been raised in, either ending, amounted to the same thing. And then, in the pale gray light of that morning, something else began to happen. Robert Leckie watched it happen. He wrote about it later, in the memoir he would call Helmet for My Pillow, and the passage is worth sitting. He described American Marines moving out onto the sandbar among the Japanese dead, to bury them. Not to collect intelligence, to search them, to turn them over, to go through their pockets, to take things. And the strange detail Leckie noticed, the detail that has lived in that book for 80 years now, was this. The souvenir hunters were nervous. They stepped delicately between. They moved the way a man moves through a room he is not sure. They picked their way among the enemy dead, Leckie wrote, as though they were already afraid of what those bodies might be hiding. Nobody had told them anything yet. There was no order, there was no intelligence bulletin, there was no sergeant screaming at them to be careful. It was August of 1942. The war in the Pacific was 2 weeks old for the men of the 1st Marine Division. And yet, somehow, some instinct in the animal part of their brains had already started to whisper. Something is wrong here. Something about a dead man who left a sword out in the open is wrong. They didn't know why. They couldn't have said why. But the fear was already alive in them, weeks before command would ever give it a name. That instinct would turn out to be right. It would take another 2 years and thousands of miles of ocean, and the deaths of men whose names are now written on stones in cemeteries their mothers never got to visit, before American intelligence would finally put words to what those first Marines on the Tenaru had sensed in the wet morning air. The dead man was rarely the trap. The ground around the sword was. To understand why a young American Marine would risk his life for one, you have to understand what he thought he was reaching for. And here is where almost everyone gets the story wrong, including in many cases the men who carried these things home in their duffel bags. The blade lying in the dirt beside that dead officer was almost never a samurai sword in the old sense. That word samurai calls up something specific in the imagination. A blade forged in a mountain village by a master who spent months folding steel over itself. A weapon handed down through a bloodline. A treasure in the truest sense. That is not what most American Marines were picking up. The correct word is gunto. It simply means military sword. It was the standard issue blade of the Japanese officer corps, and by the time of the Pacific War, the majority of gunto were factory products. They were manufactured, machined, sharpened, and issued the same way any modern Army issues equipment. The most common one an American Marine would find was the Type 98 Shin Gunto, the standard Army officer's blade adopted in 1938. It was based on an older, fancier version called the Type 94 from 1930. There was also a cheaper version called the Type 95, carried by sergeants and non-commissioned officers, machine produced with a serial number stamped on. The Navy had its own variant called the Kai Gunto, distinguished by a black ray skin scabbard. Most of these blades were mass-produced weapons, nothing more. Steel from a factory floor, wrapped in cord, mounted in fittings, shipped to a young officer who had probably never held a real sword in his. But here is the part that made the whole system so seductive and so dangerous. A minority of those blades were the real thing, traditionally forged, hand-hammered by a swordsmith in the old way. Collectors and historians debate the exact figure, but according to some widely cited estimates, only a small percentage of wartime blades produced at the Seki sword-making center were fully traditional pieces, and a much smaller number, a vanishing fraction, were something else entirely. They were ancestral blades, real ones, hundreds of years old, handed down through a Japanese family from father to son to grandson through generations of people. And then, at the outbreak of the Pacific conflict, taken out of a family altar, wrapped carefully in silk, and bolted into plain military fittings so that a grandson could carry a piece of his ancestor. Most trophies were ordinary steel. A rare few were priceless. And the young American Marine reaching for one in the smoke and the half-light had no way of knowing which he had. That was part of the pull. Every sword was a lottery ticket. Every sword might be the one your grandchildren would talk about. And that gamble, that thin possibility, was strong enough to make a man break cover and cross open ground. There were other trophies too, smaller, easier to carry. The Type 14 Nambu pistol, chambered in 8x22 millimeter. To an American eye, it looked like a German Luger, so that is what they called it. The Japanese, something in the neighborhood of a few 100,000 were made, though the true number is impossible to know, because Japanese soldiers treated their weapons as the personal property of the emperor. Many destroyed their own pistols rather than let them fall into enemy hands. There was also the smaller Type 94 pistol. It had an exposed sear bar on the side of the frame that could, in certain circumstances, fire the weapon if it was bumped hard enough against a solid object. The Americans gave that one a name too, the suicide gun. And then there were the personal things, the good luck flag, a Japanese national flag, a white rectangle with a red sun in the center, covered in inked signatures from family, neighbors, teachers, employers. Every signature a prayer for the soldier's safe return. A man carried it folded against his chest, under his uniform, next to his heart. The 1,000-stitch cloth sash sewn by 1,000 different women, each of whom had contributed a single red stitch. In the belief system of wartime Japan, those 1,000 stitches were meant to turn a bullet aside. Small, portable, intensely personal, easy to fold up and mail home in an envelope to a girl in Kansas who would never understand what she was holding. The single most common souvenir of the entire Pacific War. Every American who lived through those years remembers the newsreels. the black and white footage, the voice of the announcer, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. Names that meant nothing to a child sitting on the floor of a living room in 1944, and everything to the men who never came back. The demand for these souvenirs got so high, so fast, that a bootleg economy began to bloom around it. Australian troops fighting alongside the Americans in the Southwest Pacific started manufacturing counterfeit samurai swords in their rear areas and selling them to American servicemen who couldn't. On Guadalcanal itself, American Marines with time on their hands began forging fake Japanese flags. They studied the characters on the labels of captured Japanese food cans, copied the script by hand onto white cloth, dabbed in a red sun with whatever paint they could scrounge, and sold the results to sailors passing through. The trade in dead men's things had become so lucrative that men were faking the dead men themselves. And all of this, the joke about souvenirs, the nervous hunters on the Tenaru sandbar, the counterfeit flags, the ancestral blades bolted into factory fittings, all of it was happening in 1942. The real trap hadn't even been sprung yet. The Japanese army was watching. It was learning. It was noticing what the American Marines wanted and what they were willing to risk to get it. And somewhere on some staff level of the Imperial Japanese Command, a very simple, very cold idea was beginning. If the enemy loves our swords this much, then let us give them our. Let us leave them out in the open. Let us set them near our positions, and let us wait. To understand why a man would turn his own sword into bait, you have to understand what the sword meant to him. And to understand that, you have to go back further than the war, further than Pearl Harbor, further than the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. You have to go back into the bones of a country that had spent 70 years trying to decide what kind of country it wanted to be. In 1868, Japan opened itself to the modern world. In the space of a single generation, it built railroads and steamships, factories and schools, an army modeled on the Prussians, and a navy modeled on the British. It stopped being a feudal kingdom and became an industrial power. And in the process, it did something that almost no other country in history has ever done. It abolished, by law, the class of men who had defined its identity for 700 years. The samurai were gone. At the time Robert Leckie was born, and Kiyonao Ichiki and Eugene Sledge, the samurai were already something a grandfather told a child about while pointing to a scroll on the wall. But you cannot kill an idea that easily. And in the 1930s, as the Japanese army marched deeper into China and the militarists took control of the government in Tokyo, something strange began to happen. The idea of the samurai came back, not the men themselves. The image of them, the myth of them, the code. The government printed pamphlets. Schools taught new lessons. Officers were told in speeches that were half history and half religion that they were the spiritual heirs of the men who had once walked the roads of feudal Japan with a blade at their hip. They were told that Japan's true strength was not in her factories or her ships. It was in a thing called Bushido, the way of the warrior. And at the very heart of Bushido, the object that made the whole thing visible was the sword. The sword became the badge of an officer's rank. Every commissioned officer in the Imperial Japanese Army was required to wear one. He wore it on parade. He wore it in the field. He wore it in the mud of a jungle 10,000 miles from home. And in the romantic language of the era, the language a young lieutenant read in his manuals and heard in his training, the sword was described in a specific way. The sword was the soul of the warrior. Say that phrase out loud. Sit with it. Because if you don't understand what those words meant to the man carrying that blade, nothing else in this story will make sense. The sword was not a weapon. The sword was him. It was his rank. It was his honor. It was the visible sign of his ancestors watching over him. It was, in the deepest sense the culture could offer, the extension of his own spirit, made of steel and silk cord, hanging from his belt. Imagine, then, a young Japanese lieutenant of that era. He is 23 years old. He grew up in a small town somewhere south of Tokyo. His family kept his boyhood photographs on a shelf, and one of them shows him in his officer's uniform on the day he was commissioned, his new sword at his hip, looking straight into the camera with the flat expression of a young man who already suspects he will not grow old. Young men like him wrote letters home. Thousands of those letters have been preserved in Japanese archives and family homes. In them, they told their mothers that they were well, that the food was good, that she should not worry. They rarely told her the rest. They rarely told her that, as the war ground on, and Japan lost island after island, they were increasingly instructed to fight in ways that used every possible advantage, including the enemy's own hunger for their swords. Now think about what happened when one of those young men fell. Think about him lying face down in the sand of an island whose name he could not have pronounced 2 years earlier. Think about a young American Marine walking up to him, rolling him over with the toe of a boot, unbuckling the sword from his belt, and carrying it. To that American Marine, it was a trophy, a prize, something to show his father back home. Something to trade for cigarettes or canned ham or a bottle of whiskey smuggled off a Navy ship. To the man he had just taken it from and to the family waiting for him thousands of miles away, it was something else entirely. It was the theft of his soul, the desecration of his ancestors, the final unbearable insult performed on his body while he was still warm. And this is where the trap begins to make sense, because if you understand what the sword meant, you understand the logic that followed. The cold, brutal, almost mathematical logic that turned the object into. The enemy loves my soul so much that he will risk his life for it. Then let me use his love against him. Let me lay my soul out where he can see it and let his greed for it undo him. Now let us go to Saipan, the summer of 1944. The heat is different here, not the wet heat of the southern jungle. A dry, salt, cracked heat that comes off the coral and the volcanic rock and turns the inside of a helmet into a bread oven by 10 in the morning. The island is small, about 14 miles long, 5 miles wide, shaped like a footprint pressed into the blue Pacific. But it is Japanese home territory in a way the earlier islands were not. There are civilians here, whole villages of them. There is a sugar refinery. There are schools, and there is a garrison of tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers dug into the caves and the ridges and the sugarcane fields, ordered to hold this ground to the last man. American Marines came ashore on the 15th of June, 1944. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by the Army's 27th Infantry. What they walked into was weeks of some of the worst fighting the Pacific had yet seen. And somewhere in the middle of that fighting, in the caves above the northern beaches of the island, one specific version of the trophy trap the Japanese had been quietly refining for 2 years finally showed itself for what it was. There is a document. It is not a novel. It is not a memoir. It is an official publication of the United States War Department from December of 1944, the Intelligence Bulletin. In its pages, a senior American officer described what his men had been finding on Saipan in words so plain they read almost like a police. Japanese soldiers hiding in the natural limestone caves of the island had begun setting swords and rifles near the mouth, out in the open, where a souvenir hunter could see them, where the sunlight would catch the polished steel and pull a man's eyes toward it from far away. An American Marine would spot the trophy. He would look around. He would see nothing but rocks and the black opening of the cave. He would break cover. He would move in. And a sniper, hidden deep in the darkness of the cave, would be waiting. The officer's report contained a phrase that has sat inside American military intelligence documents for 80 years now. The trick worked, he wrote. There were many unnecessary casualties. He recommended that any area with a suspected sniper cave be placed off limits to trophy hunting until the threat had been eliminated. Not court-martial, not punishment. Just, please, walk away from the sword. Please, because we are losing men to it. Read that phrase again. There were many unnecessary casualties, because those are not the words of a general writing for history. Those are the words of a working officer, exhausted, watching young men die for a piece of steel, and trying, in the flat and careful language of a report, to make his superiors understand that the situation had become intolerable. That is one of the strongest pieces of period evidence we have that the bait was killing American Marines. Not a movie, not a legend, not a story told around a campfire. A high-ranking officer filing a report, asking his own army to please just leave the trophies where they lay. But that was only one version of the trap. Because the story you have probably seen in films is not quite the only version the documents describe. It is close, and it is plausible, and it fits everything the Japanese army was known to do. But it is worth being careful about which mechanism is which. The cinematic version goes like this. A pristine sword laid across a dead officer's chest, an almost invisible wire running from the hilt of the blade down through the dirt to a buried grenade. The American Marine lifts the sword. The wire pulls taut. The grenade detonates. The squad is gone. That mechanism is dramatic. It is film. It is the kind of thing a screenwriter reaches for when he wants to compress an idea into a single shot, and it is not the mechanism the surviving documents most clearly describe. In that same intelligence bulletin of December 1944, alongside the Saipan cave account, there is a separate report from an American cavalryman who had fought in the Admiralty Islands earlier that year. His description of the tactic there is as plain as it gets. The Japanese, he wrote, planted many booby traps using swords, and the usual method was to place a landmine close by, positioned so that a man would step on it while trying to pick the trophy up. Read that carefully. No wire from the hilt of the sword, no mechanical link between the trophy and the explosive. The trap was a pressure mine, buried in the dirt, waiting for a foot, a hand. You were not killed for touching the sword. In many cases, you were killed for walking up to it. That is the answer to the mystery in the opening of this video. That is why a young American Marine could die before he even got his fingers on the blade. The ground killed him. The sword was just the reason he was standing there. Now, it is important to be honest here. The trophy trap was not a single uniform system used the same way on every island. On Saipan, according to the December 1944 intelligence bulletin, the specific technique commanders were warning about was the sword or rifle laid near the mouth of a cave, with a sniper waiting inside. In the Admiralties, according to the same bulletin, the technique was a landmine buried near the trophy. On other islands, Japanese engineers rigged bodies, tombs, and abandoned positions with grenades and improvised charges of every kind. The trophy ruse was one thread inside a much larger tapestry of booby traps that Japanese combat engineers had turned into an art form after Japan shifted to a defensive war in 1943 and 1944. When grenades ran short, they improvised. On the island of Tarakan, Australian troops fighting alongside the Americans discovered a booby trap built out of a captured 5-inch Dutch naval shell. The trophy itself did not need to be wired to anything sophisticated. The dirt around it just had to be patient, and the dirt on those islands was very patient. By 1944 and into 1945, the booby trap in all its forms had become a kind of background noise for America. They rigged caves, they rigged tombs, they rigged abandoned positions and empty ammunition dumps, they rigged bicycles left leaning against walls, and, in more than a few documented cases, they rigged the bodies of their own dead. The trophy ruse was one small, vicious tool inside that larger system. It was not the main weapon. The main weapon was the mine and the tunnel and the machine gun in the hill. But the trophy trap had one advantage that no other weapon in the Japanese arsenal possessed. It used the enemy's own psychology against him. Every other Japanese weapon required the American Marine to be somewhere he did not want to be. The trophy trap invited him, called him, whispered his name across an open field. And by the time the war reached Peleliu in the fall of 1944, the fear of it had become part of the air American Marines on the line breathed. A young man named Eugene Bondurant Sledge went ashore at Peleliu on the 15th of September, 1944. He was 21 years old. He was the son of a physician from Mobile, Alabama. He had grown up hunting birds with his father in the woods of the Deep South, and he had enlisted in the Marine Corps against his family's wishes because he could not stand the thought of the war. He was a mortarman, 60mm mortar, King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, in the shorthand of the Corps, K-35. Later, he would write one of the most important books of the entire war. He called it With the Old Breed. He wrote it slowly, over decades, sitting at a desk in Alabama trying to put down what he had seen without letting his hands shake. The book is one of the reasons we know what we know about the last 2 years of the Pacific War. And in that book, Sledge described the trophy hunting with an unflinching eye. He described American Marines who had become so obsessed with taking souvenirs from the enemy dead that they would risk their lives to do it. He described men gloating over their pride, trading them, comparing them like schoolboys comparing baseball cards. He described a savagery, he wrote, that was particular to the war between the American Marines and the Japanese. He watched a fellow Marine try to pull the gold teeth out of a dying Japanese soldier's mouth with the point of a kabar knife. The Japanese soldier was still alive. Barely. His eyes were open. Sledge watched, and he wrote about it because he thought the world needed to know what a war like this one did to the men who fought in it. If you had an uncle who fought in the Pacific, you know the silence I am talking about. The way he would set down his fork at Thanksgiving dinner when someone asked the wrong question. The way he would look out the window for a long moment and then change the subject. He was not the only one. On the island of Okinawa the following spring, American Marines pushing through the Ryukyu Islands found themselves fighting in a landscape dotted with old family tombs, low stone structures shaped like turtles. The Japanese army had learned to rig. Any American Marine who ducked into one for cover or leaned in to see if anything valuable was inside could be blown across the courtyard. Marine memoirs and unit histories from Okinawa contain accounts of just such traps set at tomb entrances that scared the life out of the men who found them. That was the environment. That was the air American infantry breathed for months on end. Every sword was a question, every flag was a question, every tomb, every hut, every dead man in the field was a question with no good answer. And through all of it, American command tried to give an order. Do not touch it. Do not touch any of it. Walk past. But here is a truth that the neat version of this story tends to hide. And you deserve the honest version. American commanders in the Pacific did not, as a rule, court-martial men simply for picking up a sword. The image of a young American Marine dragged before a military tribunal for pocketing a Japanese pistol is largely a myth. What actually happened was quieter and messier and more human. The orders were issued. Warnings were printed in bulletins. Areas were placed off limits, the way the officer at Saipan had recommended. Senior officers invoked the 80th Article of War, which governed the handling of captured and abandoned property, and they sometimes held it over their men's heads as a threat. If you take that sword, you are dealing in captured property. That is a court-martial offense. But the men did it anyway. They did it because they were young. They did it because they were exhausted. They did it because they had just watched a friend die, and they wanted something, anything, that felt like it belonged to the war they had survived. They did it because the sword was beautiful, and it was there. And they were 20 years old, and they were going to live forever until the moment they weren't. American command was fighting a losing battle against its own soldiers, and that battle was about more than swords. Because the trophy hunting did not stop at swords and flags. It is well documented, and it needs to be said honestly, that some American troops in the Pacific mutilated the Japanese dead. They took gold teeth, they took ears. In a small number of cases that made it back into the American press and horrified people at home, they took skulls. It was common enough that in September of 1942, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, issued a formal order. No part of the enemy's body was to be used as a souvenir. Violators would face stern disciplinary action. The next year, in 1943, General George Marshall in Washington communicated with General Douglas MacArthur about the atrocity reports that were reached. In 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military authority in the United States, weighed in as well with directives against the mutilation of enemy dead. The orders existed because the behavior was real. Historians still argue about how widespread it was. Most American Marines did not do these things, a minority. But the fact that Nimitz and Marshall and the Joint Chiefs themselves felt the need to weigh in tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the problem. And here is the twist that ties this whole part together. The order not to pick up the sword was not just about grenades in the dirt. It was not just about snipers in caves. It was part of a much larger battle that American command was quietly fighting. They were fighting to keep their own men human. They were watching young men come home from island after island with things in their duffel bags that no mother should ever have to unpack. They were watching a generation of American Marines start to become something they would not be able to live with. Once the war was over and the shooting stopped, and they had to sit at a kitchen table with a wife across from them and pretend to be the boy who had gone. The order to walk past the sword was, in part, an order to walk past the abyss. Do not reach for the trophy. Do not roll the body over. Do not become the thing this war is trying to turn you into. Some of the men listened. Many of them did not, and there was one more reason, small and unromantic, and never mentioned in the movies. That command wanted the men to leave the dead alone. Disease. Bodies in tropical heat rot fast, faster than a man from a temperate country can imagine. Within hours, the flesh begins to swell. Within a day, the skin begins to split. The flies find them immediately. The maggots follow. And every fluid that seeps out of a body in that condition is a vector for something that can kill you slower and more horribly than any grenade. Sledge wrote about it again and again in his memoir. The fear and the filth went hand in hand. He described the mud of Peleliu and Okinawa, mud made of rain and blood and the liquid remains of unburied men. And he wrote that picking through corpses for trophies was one of the fastest ways to end up dying in a field hospital of something you could not even name. So the order stood, do not pick up the sword, because a mine may be near it, because a sniper may be watching it, because your enemy has weaponized his own soul against you, because commandant trying to keep you from becoming a man your children will not rest, and because the dead man in the dirt is already carrying diseases your immune system has never met. 5 reasons, stacked on top of each other, each one enough to kill a young American Marine on its own. And still, on island after island, in the smoke and the half-light, they kept reaching down. So what, in the end, was the answer to the question in the title of this video? Why were American Marines told, over and over again, on island after island, never to pick up a Japanese sword? You already know the reasons. Mines, snipers, intelligence lost, the slow moral rot command was trying to prevent, and the simple animal decay of a body left in the sun. 5 reasons standing in a line behind that sword in the dirt. But now we owe you the honest number, because there is something the popular version of this story leaves out, and it is the twist that closes the whole picture. Japanese officers and non-commissioned officers carried an enormous number of swords into the Pacific War. Historians and collectors have long debated the exact figure. The most credible estimates run from several 100,000 into the range of 1 million or more when you count both officers' Shin Gunto and the machine-produced Type 95 blades issued to non-commissioned officers. A large portion of those swords by the end of the war ended up in American hands. Hundreds of thousands of them came home in American duffel bags. They came home to farmhouses in Iowa. They came home to walk-up apartments in Brooklyn. They came home to little bungalows in Los Angeles and to sharecropper cabins in Mississippi, and to every place in between that had sent a young man to the Pacific and gotten one back. And here is the truth that has to be said plainly. The overwhelming majority of those swords were taken without a scratch. They came off surrenders. They came off abandoned supply dumps. They came from Japanese officers who had thrown down their weapons at the end of the war and handed them over in ceremonies that lasted 20 seconds. They came from bodies that held no trap at all. Just a dead man in the dirt with a sword beside him and nothing under the ground but ordinary soil. The booby-trapped trophy was a real danger. It was documented. It killed men. It generated intelligence bulletins and orders from senior officers, and the fear that Robert Leckie had watched moving through those first souvenir hunters in the summer of 1942. But measured against the vast machinery of Japanese mines and artillery and machine gun fire, it was a small thing. The legend of it grew larger than the truth of it. The story became, in some ways, more dangerous than the sword itself. And that is worth sitting with, because it does not make the order any less important. It makes it more important. Every American Marine who reached for a blade in the smoke was gambling with his life on a question he could not answer. Is this one of the safe ones, or is this one of the ones with a grenade 3 feet to the left of the hilt, waiting under a piece of tin for the weight of my boot? The math was almost always in his favor. Almost. And almost is a word that has killed a lot of young men in a lot of wars. The order was right. The warning was right. The sergeants who told their men to walk past the trophy were right, because the price of being wrong, even once, was a boy who never came home. And a mother in a small American town who opened her front door one morning to find a chaplain and a Western Union man standing on the porch. Most of those swords never went back to Japan. They came home instead. And once they got here, most of them stopped moving. They went into attic trunks. They went into hall closets. They went into the back of a bedroom shelf, wrapped in an old shirt behind the boxes of Christmas. They sat in American houses for decades in dust and darkness and silence. And here is the strange, quiet twist at the end of this part of the story, a twist that anyone who has ever lost a father or an uncle to the Pacific War already understands in his bones. The men who brought those swords home did not, for the most part, want to talk about them. They did not hang them over the mantelpiece. They did not show them off to the neighbors. They did not tell the story of how they had come by them, because the story of how you came by a Japanese sword in 1944 or 1945 was almost never a story you could tell over a Sunday dinner with your wife and your children at the table. The trophy that a 20-year-old had once been willing to die for became, in the hands of a 50-year-old, a thing he could not quite look, something he had put away, something that lived in his house but not in his life. You have known men like this. If you are the age of the men this video was made for, you have known them your whole life. Your father, maybe. Your uncle. The neighbor across the street who mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings and never said a word about the years he had spent in the South Pacific until one summer afternoon when you were 15 and helping him carry a box down from the attic. And something long and heavy shifted inside it, and he looked at you and said quietly, "That is not for now." The souvenir had become the burden. The prize had become the ghost. The men who came home from that war are almost all gone now. If your father is still alive, he is likely in his late 90s or older. If he is gone, the questions you never asked him are gone with him. But the swords are still here, attics, in closets, waiting. A lot of American Marines who came home from the Pacific spent the rest of their lives quietly wishing they had walked past the sword in the dirt. Not because it had exploded, because it had not. Because they had carried it home instead and the war had come home with it. The good luck flags were the same. The Yosagaki Hinomaru, those white cloths with the red sun in the center and the ink signatures crowded around it like a family gathered for a photograph. Recent estimates suggest that tens of thousands of those flags are still somewhere in the United States, sitting in boxes and drawers and safety deposit vaults from Maine to California. Many thousands more are scattered across. Every one of them was written on by a family, a mother, a father, a sister, a schoolteacher, an old man from down the road who had signed the corner and drawn a small character next to his name, a wish, a blessing, a promise to remember. And every one of them belonged to a young Japanese man who did not come home. Your father is still alive, and he brought something home from that war. Do not ask him about the fighting. Ask him about what he brought home. Ask him where it came from. And then be quiet. Let him talk, or let him not talk, whichever he needs. Because in 10 years, or 5, or 1, that door will close. And whatever he never told you will be gone. And if he is already gone, and you have found something in his house that you do not know what to do with, a sword, a flag, a folded piece of white cloth with Japanese writing on it, there is an answer, which brings us at last to a small town on the northern coast of Oregon. The town is called Astoria. It sits at the mouth of the Columbia River, where the water is gray and the sky is gray and the fishing boats come in through weather that has not changed in 150 years. It is not the kind of place where you expect the last act of a war to be quietly playing itself out. And yet in that town, there is an organization called the Obon Society. It was founded by an American husband and a Japanese wife, Rex and Keiko Ziak, who noticed something a lot of the rest of us had missed. They noticed that all across America, in attics and closets and estate sales, those good luck flags were surfacing. Grandchildren of Pacific War veterans were finding them when their grandfathers died. Widows were finding them when they finally cleaned out the study. Antique dealers were pulling them out of storage lockers. The flags had signatures on them, names, places, sometimes even addresses, and the Obon Society began, patiently, one flag at a time, to read those signatures like fingerprints, to trace them back, to find the towns the signatures had come from, and then to find the families, and then to knock on a door in rural Japan and hand a woman in her 90s something her older brother had been wearing next to his heart the last time she saw him. According to the organization itself, they have returned hundreds of items to Japanese families so far. Measured against the more than 1 million Japanese servicemen from the Pacific War whose remains have never been recovered, that number is almost nothing. It is a rounding error. It is a whisper against a hurricane. And it is everything to the family. Think about that door for a second. Because if you can see it in your mind, if you can see an old woman in a small house in a small Japanese town opening her front door to a stranger holding a folded white cloth with her father's handwriting on it, then you understand something about this war that no textbook can teach you. You understand that the young American Marine who took that flag off a body in the sand of Iwo Jima in February of 1945 did not know what he was taking. You understand that he could not have known. He was 19 years old. He was cold and scared and half-starved, and he had just watched his best friend die, and he took the cloth because it was there, and because it was quiet and small, and it fit inside his jacket. And he brought it home, and he lived a whole life with it in a drawer, and he died without ever telling anyone what it was. And his grandchildren found it after his funeral and did not know what to do. And now, 80 years later, an old woman in Japan is holding it in her hands and reading her father's handwriting for the first time in her. That is the story we are telling. That is what the sword in the dirt was pointing toward the whole time. You already know what the sword was to the man who carried it. It was everything, and it is what made the blade the perfect bait. Because the enemy who understood how much you wanted his soul could set it out where you could see it and wait for you to come get it. He could turn your admiration into a weapon. He could turn your greed into a grave. That was the dark, cold, brilliant logic of the trophy trap. And it worked on Saipan and Pelew and Okinawa and every island in between, often enough to become a warning that has echoed through American military intelligence documents ever since. But the legend is not where the story ends. Because 80 years after the last shot was fired in the Pacific, the most emotionally charged trophy of that war is finally, quietly, being carried back the other way. Not by governments, not by armies, not by any grand ceremony with cameras and flags, by ordinary Americans, by grandsons and granddaughters and widows and estate lawyers who found something in a drawer and could not, in good conscience, throw it. By the volunteers at a small office in Astoria, Oregon, who spend their days reading Japanese signatures with a magnifying glass. By an old woman in a house on the other side of the ocean who has waited 80 years for the sound of a knock on her door. The swords are going home. The flags are going home. The trap that killed young American Marines in the dirt of a dozen islands is being disarmed, one artifact at a time, by the quiet decency of the people who inherited it and did not know what else to do. And every one of them is going back not as treasure, not as a trophy, not as a weapon. Every one of them is going back as somebody's brother, somebody's son. A young man who left a small house in a small town in Japan in the early 1940s and told his mother he would come home and did not, and whose only remaining piece has been sitting in a drawer in Ohio or Texas or California for the last 3/4 of a century, waiting for someone to know. They are noticing now. If you are watching this, and you are the age of the men this story was made for, then you may have known one of the Americans who brought a sword home. You may have grown up in a house where one sat in the attic. You may have wondered once, quietly, what to do with it now that the man who carried it home is gone. There is an answer. The Oban Society is in Astoria, Oregon. They will read the flag. They will find the family. They will do it patiently, and they will do it without charging the family for the service. And they will not ask you to explain why the artifact is in your house or how it got there. They understand. They have understood from the beginning, and somewhere, on the other side of the ocean, an old woman is waiting. The war is not over for her yet, but it could be. And in the end, that is the last quiet answer to the question we started this video with. Why were American Marines ordered never to pick up a Japanese sword? Because the sword was the soul of a man. Because the soul of a man is not a souvenir. Because there are some things that do not belong in a duffel bag on a troop ship. There are some things that belong at home, in the hands of a family, on an altar in a small house in a small town, where they can finally, after all these years, be. 80 years is a long time to wait, but the swords are coming home. And they are not coming home as treasure. They are coming home as son.